Today on Gulf Streams, we're diving into the world of cloud seeding, where science, innovation, and controversy meet in the sky. Cloud seeding, or the practice of dispersing certain substances in clouds to increase precipitation, has been of key interest globally, with trials being conducted in Texas and the United States, India, and Dubai alike in 2025. Still, despite this international exposure, it still feels more opaque, or cloudy, than ever. We're Antara Varma and Sara Tabrez, student interns for the Rice Center of Environmental Studies, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Today, to unpack some of the science and intricacies of cloud seeding, we're joined by two special guests. Dr. Bart Geertz, a leading atmospheric scientist and glaciogenic cloud seeding researcher, and Augustus Dorico, CEO of the cloud seeding startup Rainmaker. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. We're first sitting down with Dr. Geertz, a professor of atmospheric science at the University of Wyoming. Today, he helps us separate what cloud seeding can do, what it can't do, and why the science remains more uncertain than people think. So, first off, hello and welcome to Gulf Streams. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your work so far as a researcher and a scientist?
So, me as a scientist, I'm an atmospheric scientist at the University of Wyoming. I'm a professor. I've been studying clouds and precipitation for much of my career. And as part of that, maybe not the central part, but just a part, I've also studied the impact of the injection of silver iodide as a seeding agent to enhance precipitation in clouds.
Given your work and background, can you kind of describe for our audience what cloud seeding is and at the simplest level how it works?
Yeah, the idea is that, at least for this glaciogenic seeding, that some clouds are supercooled. They have liquid droplets at temperatures below freezing, and they are not efficient in producing precipitation. And then if you somehow insert or inject some particles that nucleate ice in these supercooled liquid clouds, then you can form snow that then falls out as snowfall on the ground, maybe rain on the ground, thereby increasing the natural precipitation. This has been done in convective clouds as well as in more layered orographic clouds. There's other ways of seeding clouds using large aerosol, hygroscopic seeding, but my research has been on the ice-inducing seeding or glaciogenic seeding.
And kind of following up with that, for our audience, can you describe kind of what conditions have to be just right for this type of cloud seeding to work?
These conditions are really not that complicated. In principle, you need to have the supercooled liquid water. So you need to have cloud droplets, a large number of cloud droplets or sufficient liquid water in the cloud at temperatures below that threshold where the seeding agent starts to become active as an ice nucleus. That is around -6 °C. So you want this supercooled liquid to be present at temperatures below, say, 20 Fahrenheit. At extremely low temperatures, below about -20 °C, that is -4 Fahrenheit, you tend to see natural ice forming. There is enough aerosol out there on which ice can form naturally. But it's in that range somewhere between -6 and -20 C that you may find supercooled liquid cloud that persists and does not turn into ice. And those conditions are optimal.
Now that we have kind of this background on cloud seeding, can you explain a little bit about why cloud seeding is important and what are its potential benefits? And maybe also why you've kind of decided to specialize in these glaciogenic field for cloud seeding specifically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in principle, this glaciogenic seeding works best wherever there's a lot of liquid water. And that turns out in places where it rains a lot. Like, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Seattle, they get a lot of rain in the winter. And there's a lot of supercooled liquid also in the clouds out there. But cloud seeding typically is not done up there because there's plenty of rain. So it's in the more arid regions. If you go to that same area, Pacific Northwest, but to the east side of the mountains, the Cascade Mountains, it's quite dry. And so in that dry interior part of the western US, cloud seeding is conducted over the mountains where you have these orographic clouds where most of the precipitation falls, and much of that in the winter falls as snow. It serves as a reservoir of water for the warm season runoff and supporting stream flow, agricultural activities, and all the uses of water. So in the interior US, that's where it's conducted. In California, it's also conducted along the coast. But otherwise, it's mostly done in places that are relatively dry, which may sound counterintuitive because there's really not all that much supercooled liquid, but that's where the demand for water is higher. So there's more, I guess, more economic interest in squeezing out some more of that moisture out of the clouds. Sorry, you had a second part to your question. I forget now.
I just asked like the different benefits that you see working in cloud seeding, and also why you how decide to specialize in like the glaciogenic.
Oh yeah, glaciogenic seeding, because it has been demonstrated to work. We've done some field work and others before us too, but really the work we've done in Idaho, especially Bob Rauber was involved with that, and many others. It's demonstrated that you find the supercooled liquid clouds, first of all, and second, that when you seed them, that they do produce snowfall. It's been shown with various instruments, including aircraft, in situ ice particle probes and liquid water probes, and also radar. So we know that it works through glaciogenic seeding. Hygroscopic seeding is more questionable. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of to follow up, I know that like you've done extensive, research in Wyoming, and you've led specifically major field campaigns like ASCII, Snowy, like various campaigns that have, validated cloud seeding as a tool. So can you talk a little bit about these campaigns and what made, for example, ASCII different from Snowy as a campaign in like as a turning point in cloud seeding research?
Yeah, good question. So this campaign, we call it ASCII, was funded by the National Science Foundation as a piggybacking research activity on an investigation funded by the state of Wyoming at the cost of over $10 million. Wyoming paid for this multi-year randomized seeding experimental evaluation. So several mountains in Wyoming were targeted with ground-based seeding generators. And we, through funding from the National Science Foundation, brought in an aircraft, and University of Wyoming King Air, several radars, and other instrumentation in the mountains to evaluate the impact of seeding on the cloud properties and then on precipitation. So rather than just looking at the snowfall, we wanted to look at the chain of effect from the point where you inject silver iodide to the point where the snow falls on the ground along the way. And we found that there was some enhancement in the ice particle concentration and an increase in precipitation. But we didn't see these well-defined plumes that we would later find in the Snowy campaign. The difference between the ASCII and the Snowy campaign is that the earlier ASCII campaign focused on the ground-based seeding. So there were these generators, basically propane burning generators that injected silver iodide particles into the atmosphere. And the hope was that it would then blow into the clouds aloft. With airborne seeding, you can more surgically inject that silver iodide in the supercooled cloud. You can first measure where that cloud is and then release the silver iodide with these ejectable or in situ silver iodide generators attached to the aircraft. So in Snowy, we did this airborne seeding, and there we saw a very clear signal. We had the zigzag patterns you may have heard about, where the seeding aircraft flies back and forth through a supercooled liquid cloud that is being blown sideways across the flight track. And so the aircraft leaves behind a trail of enhanced radar reflectivity. It's similar to, imagine that you see a jet aircraft producing a contrail, right? One that flies really high. In the cirrus layer, they produce these contrails naturally. And imagine that aircraft, instead of flying right across from horizon to horizon, it flies back and forth. Then it would also leave behind a zigzag contrail, because the wind will carry that contrail sideways. So this is what we found within the cloud, but then not a contrail, but rather a path of enhanced snowfall. So Snowy was in a way more effective. And I think many people started to believe that seeding could work under some circumstances. Not all cases that we examined in Snowy were successful, maybe only 4. Cases had really sufficient supercooled liquid. And again, we cannot predict that supercooled liquid very well. That's the biggest challenge, the suitable targeting.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot more sense because like I guess I now understand that like ASCII as like a campaign was like a lot more kind of, it showed that it didn't necessarily prove that seeding worked, but maybe how like difficult the problem is or like how difficult to go about it. But like Snowy, you actually were able to get ice concentrations exceeding natural like background levels in these seeded regions. So it almost used what you got in the first campaign and then like actually had like not just plausible results, but like a causality.
Yeah, the chain of effect could be demonstrated much better in Snowy because we were able to inject the silver iodide in the right place, right in that supercooled cloud. We could track that with another aircraft and we could measure within that cloud. Yeah.
Yeah, but it didn't mean that seeding always like worked, or almost more like there's like that pathway you guys found where it's like seeding, then ice and snow in these clouds, but maybe not always effective.
Yeah, in many cases there is just not much supercooled liquid. You just find ice particles, numerous ice particles, and snow over great depth. It's only in some clouds, more layered clouds, where there's no ice falling from above into the supercooled layer that you can maintain the supercooled liquid, and then that makes for a good target for cloud seeding. So they're fairly special circumstances, and I'm convinced that they're more common in the places where we don't really want to seed because it rains plenty out there, like the coastal Washington and Oregon region. There's plenty of supercooled liquid water there, I think, in cloud. They have a lot more cloud also in general, but there it's not all that useful.
Yeah. And you know, about cloud seeding specifically in Houston, there's been a lot of, you know, issues and skepticism regarding whether it exacerbates flooding here. So specifically after the floods in Kerr County, Texas, there were worries that, you know, cloud seeding has had a pattern of increasing flooding and maybe affecting the climate of areas that are already high in precipitation. And I wanted to ask, how grounded are these worries?
Yeah, that unfortunate event in the hill country in Texas, the 3rd of July, 4th of July of last year, produced dramatic flooding. There were meteorological factors that are reasonably well understood. There was somewhat of a tropical disturbance that it moved in, and persistent training convective cells over that area. The terrain itself may have slightly exacerbated it at somewhat higher up compared to the area to the southeast, and there was this persistent southeasterly flow. Now, cloud seeding, does it have something to do with it? Well, for one, I think even if there was cloud seeding, the aerosol would have been washed out very quickly. It just wouldn't have mixed in over a great depth. And if there was some cloud seeding activity, it would have been a minimal effect, less than well, modeling can indicate how little it would be. It's just that this is such an efficient deep convective system where ice forms naturally over a great depth in these deep convective systems that these extra aerosol make very little difference. They could actually make a difference in either way. They could enhance or decrease it, but it would be very small. And the reality is that there was no cloud seeding, to my knowledge. Rainmaker was active, and Augustus can tell you more about that, a couple of days beforehand in the vicinity. But as I said before, cloud seeding is very targeted.
No, that's good to clear up. So going off of that, I know that like much of the cloud seeding work sits at the intersection of these models. So have you ever encountered situations where what you observed about ice initiation or growth in seeded clouds didn't match what these models predicted? And if so, like maybe like how these discrepancies change the way you think about ice nucleation efficiency when it comes to evaluating like seeding impacts?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did some numerical simulations in both campaigns, and they were essentially going hand in hand with the observations. Um, One thing I learned is that it's not all that easy to reproduce the clouds that you observe. Sometimes they're more layered, sometimes they're more cumuliform or convective. That is captured reasonably well, but the exact vertical extent of the cloud, and then especially its presence of supercooled liquid, that is difficult to simulate. Um, Yes, supercooled liquid water in general is poorly understood. It's in part because we don't really know how ice nucleates naturally, especially that what's called secondary ice nucleation or ice multiplication. In some cases, we find just about as many ice crystals as there are ice nucleating particles in the environment, aerosol particles. But in many other cases, especially at higher temperatures, we find many more ice crystals, orders of magnitude, hundreds, thousands, more ice particles. Then there are ice nucleating particles in the environment. So there's some multiplication process that is really not well understood physically, and therefore it's not represented accurately in the model. And therefore, models don't quite capture that supercooled water very well. Therefore, we don't predict it well, and so the operational cloud seeders don't really know when to seed. So that's one thing I learned, that we cannot really capture the supercooled liquid very well. But there were situations where the cloud itself was captured pretty well as compared to our radar measurements. Um, and then the seeding effect, that it was in the end more or less consistent with the observational evidence in ASCII, that over the course of the entire season showed basically that most cases just were not effective. All the seeding was a bit of a waste because there was almost no supercooled liquid. But in some cases in ASCII were productive, and the net result was there was a very slight but statistically insignificant increase in the precipitation. Observations and the model agreed in that. The model was run many times over for all these cases under different assumptions of how much supercooled liquid was there to changes in the parameterizations of these ice initiation processes. In Snowy, we did the same thing. Essentially, we did the observations for airborne seeding, as I said, and there too, for these cases where we did see supercooled liquid, it was pretty hard for the model to reproduce the supercooled liquid. But then when we had tuned the model well enough, then the model did produce the same zigzag patterns that we observed with radar. And overall, over the course of this season, some increase was observed over the target area and downwind of the target area, actually. But again, very small amounts, because if you look at the distribution of cases, most cases essentially are zero productivity. They don't yield any extra precipitation. And yeah.
You talked a little bit about kind of different entities' choice in kind of investing in cloud seeding. Despite it, evolving a lot, there being skepticism. So I had a question, given that climate change is increasing, drought severity, and also reducing snowpack reliability, and the cloud seeding as a tool tends to, have a more limited conditional effect. How do you think about its value going forward? Do you think it's worth continued investment as a short-term kind of still very experimental tool, or do you see maybe it becoming potentially like a more like meaningful component of a long-term like climate resilience and like water like management tool?
Yeah, it could factor in amongst the mix of tools that water managers have at their disposal. Um, but it's always going to be a niche activity uh, in terms of its quantity and magnitude. It's relatively small. In China, I gather, and I don't have the latest information on this, but China has for a long time been seeding clouds. They have weather modification offices at city levels like Beijing and Shanghai, at county levels or province levels. Um, and seeding has been conducted for a long time, especially in convective clouds in the summer. Um, Also in the Himalayas, that Tibetan area, um, with the intent to enhance precipitation primarily. And So they use it as a water management tool. I haven't really seen solid statistics on the impact. I don't think they really have that. Um, but in the Western US, I suspect it will continue to be a niche activity. Um, in other arid areas too, in the Middle East, for instance, in Australia, Israel, cloud seeding, glaciogenic seeding has been a niche activity for some time, especially if it can be demonstrated. I think with a more effective way to measure supercooled liquid water, and then B to surgically insert the silver iodide or other seeding agent into the cloud, you can actually have some significant results. And I think Rainmaker is as a new company is trying to do just that by putting drones in these supercooled liquid clouds. And over the mountains, actually, they are fairly persistent. So you can go in part of the mountain where there's this persistent updraft, supercooled liquid, and keep the drones in there. With an aircraft, you have to fly back and forth through it. But the drone could, with their heated propellers, could stay in that supercooled liquid and release a lot more silver iodide effectively. So there may be some impact, but even then it's going to be relatively small. And so it has to be a relatively inexpensive operation in order to make it economically viable.
And then kind of shifting a little bit, we've talked about the science, and you mentioned that there's also kind of a political angle to it. Dakota is trying it out. And so let's say Sada and I were mayors interested in having cloud seeding in our towns and interested in investing city funds towards it. What are some kind of policy considerations or things that you would want us to keep in mind from the scientific point of view?
At the scale of a county or a city, their funds are relatively limited. They're not going to be able to first conduct a research experiment to really try to establish whether there is any effectiveness to this seeding. So practically speaking, these smaller operations also, for instance, wintertime seeding across the Western US, summertime seeding in the Great Plains, those are typically done by relatively small groups, agencies, water utilities. Idaho Power, for instance, it's not that small, but they do it primarily for power enhancement. Statewide agencies or county level, and they typically don't have the funds to conduct the research to demonstrate efficacy. So Wyoming did put in, as I mentioned earlier, over $10 million to examine this first. The state of Wyoming at the time, I guess they had the extra funds to do that. And that was, in the end, it was an 8-year study, the Wyoming Weather Modification Pilot Project. The results were published, the report came out, and even though the results were not statistically significant, it still showed some increase, and that was sufficient for the legislation at the time to transition from research to operations, to do this every year without any more research. Basically, you believe it works, and then you go for it, right? So these cities, the smaller entities that may not have the funds for research, they're going to, if they're really out of other resources to provide water, if there's a real water shortage, then they can resort to that, I guess. But there's alternate options, right? Like a bit more effective recycling, reusing of the water, or lining of the irrigation ditches, rather than infiltrating the water into the subsoil towards the groundwater. There's various ways that allow you to control water more effectively than I think cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is sort of pie in the sky compared to other water management options.
And then we can cut this because I would hate to force you to make a stand, but I'm just personally curious. Knowing what you do about the limitations of cloud seeding, the other options available, what is your kind of personal opinion on companies like Rainmaker, who promise this as like the future of water management and climate, and everything we've ever had is going to be cured by our ability to make rain and snow? What is your kind of personal stance towards that, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, the advertising may be over the top, but certainly their techniques are novel. I really think that the idea of drone-based seeding in cloud is going to be much more effective than the seeding that we've been doing for many years in the past, ground-based or aircraft-based, because you can target much more effectively. So I wish them luck, I guess. But yeah, they're aware of the scientific literature. They have a group of people that explores, seeding agents and dispersion techniques. They have a whole group working on this drone development. My hat off to them for taking that initiative. We as academics have not gone as far as developing that drone. To get FAA approval to fly at high altitude beyond line of sight and in cloud is just formidable. They have managed to do that in specific areas. So my hat off to them. It's good that science progresses through, both these venture capitalist initiatives and then, I guess, more academic initiatives. And we work together. We hope to work with Rainmaker on evaluating their findings. But after all, it's a commercial company, so they do what they need to do in order to draw business, right? In general, I think their approach is good, but I don't want to comment on their advertising.
Yeah, I mean, to cut them some slack, that is the very classic Silicon Valley methodology. There's a reason. And I guess just to kind of, as a last thing, any student knows the power of a summary. So I just want to make sure I correctly understood that you're saying. So in your take, you would say cloud seeding is highly controlled. It's limited. It works best in areas that have this extremely ice cold water. Is that kind of a correct assessment of everything you've said so far?
Yeah, that's correct. It works best in conditions where you have what's called a super cooled water. Liquid water at temperatures below freezing, well below freezing, below minus 20 Fahrenheit. And we don't really measure those conditions very well, and we don't predict them well. The models that we have available, weather prediction models, don't really simulate that well. They go hand in hand, right? If we don't measure it well, we can also not predict it. We just don't know the physics of supercooled liquid very well. So it requires more research, I would argue.
Thank you so much for taking the time today. In this episode so far, we've learned a bit about the science of cloud seeding. To hear more about cloud seeding as an industry, let's hear from our next guest.
Today we're sitting down with Augustus Dorico, CEO of Rainmaker. So great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Stoked to talk.
Just to get us started, could you tell us a little bit about Rainmaker and the journey of the company so far?
Yeah, so Rainmaker is ultimately trying to end water scarcity. We're trying to end the ecological and agricultural disasters that come with drought by implementing next generation cloud seeding. Next generation cloud seeding Well, first of all, what is cloud seeding at all? And then what does it mean to be next generation? Cloud seeding is this intentional human mimicry of natural precipitation processes. So in nature, a lot of the rain or snow that we see occurring on its own, it happens because there's clouds that have small liquid water droplets in them. And if it weren't for small particles of dust in the clouds as well, then those water drops wouldn't have anything to glom onto, grow into precipitation-sized particles, and ultimately fall. A lot of clouds don't naturally have those natural aerosols, those natural dusts. And so if we can identify them, identify that they're not precipitating because they don't have aerosols, and then fly into those clouds with our drones and seed them, you can induce precipitation, be it in the form of rain or snow. Now, me mentioning the drones, that kind of gets into the next generation portion of this. Cloud seeding has existed for 80 years at this point. It was invented in the United States in 1946 by General Electric. And we had huge cloud seeding programs throughout the Northeast, the middle of the country, the Southeast, or the Southwest. And then they kind of fell off by the 70s and 80s. Maybe we'll talk about the history more later. But primarily, they disappeared just because it was too expensive to cloud seed and people couldn't confidently enough measure their results. And so what Rainmaker's doing is taking advanced radar hardware and satellite data processing algorithms to figure out what precipitation is man-made and what's natural so that our customers know how much water we're actually producing for them. And then we're also using drones and modern software to reduce the cost curve and the operational complexity of cloud seeding in the water that we produce.
I guess you're kind of gesturing to this with like the historical precedent, but I think it's safe to say that some of the public and scientific community still has mixed feelings about the effectiveness and execution of cloud seeding. So for you, when you first started Rainmaker, what about cloud seeding indicated to you personally that it was worth believing in and worth starting an entire company around it as an area of importance and as an area of personal risk as well as a young founder?
Yeah, with respect to scrutiny or skepticism of cloud seeding, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that like when Mullet Man from El Segundo comes to town or your university and says that he's going to change the weather, like people have a lot of questions. So that totally tracks for me. And that's why I always try to be super transparent, talk to folks, go on podcasts like this. So thanks for having me again. The thing, my arc in cloud seeding was basically having worked in water. My first startup was in groundwater regulatory compliance and realizing that we needed to make more water and hearing about this technology that nobody else had really been talking about back in 2022. That elated me, right? The notion of making it precipitate more just seems so obvious. It's one of these unconventional ideas where you think that how much it rains or how much it snows is just part of the rules of the game. When in fact, we should have this open-minded disposition to what a more technologically savvy and environmentally stewardly future we could live in. And so if we could make it rain or snow more, that sounded awesome. Then I read all the research papers on it, and you go through the first 99.5% of them, and you conclude, oh, nobody has any idea whether this works well enough because people have done statistical validation in the past. And what that means is if I have a cloud seeding program on, say, one mountain or in one county, and I seed there in all the conditions that I am looking for, that's my target region. Well, I need a control to compare the aggregate amount of snowfall to. So maybe I pick another mountain next door. The problem is the weather varies a lot. And so just the natural variability from one mountain to the next, from one region to the next, from a seeded cloud versus an unseeded cloud, it's so great that if you're doing statistical validation, it's not that you don't get any signal, but the error bars are really big. And so people for a long time have said, well, we just don't know exactly how well it's working. And even if it is working, it's too hard to price what the value of this is, given the error bars. And so I was in this slump. I was like, oh, it sounded so cool, but nobody's ever done it. It seems impossible. And then I found out about these three really, really important, like seminal research papers on attribution of precipitation to cloud seeding in real time using real measurements, physical measurements rather than statistical ones. And so the first was snowy. SNOWY was this research campaign conducted by the National Center of Atmospheric Research. You've probably heard about it, a bunch of other universities. And they realized, okay, if we have sensitive enough radar and we fly in a specific pattern, if we fly in a zigzag, and we only see precipitation in our flight track as measured on the radar, we can measure, because one, it's in this geometric pattern that would never occur in nature, that is definitely man-made. And two, we can use the radar to measure how much precipitation fell in that geometric track. So they were able to do that 3 times and produce hundreds of millions of gallons in each of their operations over the course of less than 2 hours. So that, first of all, reading that paper and finding out that you could produce that much water, it sounds like a lot, and it is. It's actually like millimeters of snow. But that's a super useful amount of water to farms, residential utilities, ecosystems. Then I found out about this study done at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, where they were able to use radar to prove that they were inducing freezing in the cloud and then precipitation. They were actually able to do it with drones for the first time in an academic context in 2023. That was Cloud Lab. And then I found out that the Chinese had innovated by using satellite data rather than just radar to measure long geometric streaks from their seeding aircraft. And so once I found out, okay, you can use radar or satellite to measure the Ur effect in real time and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is man-made precipitation, that's when I got over the line and basically started acting like a rabid dog, talking to anybody that would listen to me about cloud seeding.
And then you mentioned some of these conditions. What are some of the things you're looking for in like an ideal site?
Yeah. So there's, broadly speaking, there's a couple different categories of cloud seeding. First of all, let's just talk about precipitation enhancement, making it rain or snow more. Well, because people talk about hail suppression, they talk about severe weather mitigation, all things that have been ideated about and are theoretically possible, but it's not what Rainmaker does. Rainmaker makes it rain and snow more. So precipitation enhancement. There's glaciogenic cloud seeding, which means glacier, think of like freezing. And then there's hygroscopic cloud seeding, so attracting drops to make drops in warm clouds big enough to fall. We focus on glaciogenic cloud seeding. The reason for that being, if you can measure the phase change from liquid to ice in cloud on radar, rather than just small droplets to big droplets, as you would in hygroscopic seeding, it's easier to prove with confidence that that was your intervention. So what we look for are cold clouds with super cold liquid water, non-precipitating cold clouds with super cold liquid water. And so what is super cold liquid water? Most people think water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. It doesn't. It freezes instantaneously at like negative 38 degrees Celsius if it's totally pure water. Like I mentioned before, if you don't have natural dust in the cloud, if you don't have natural particulate or aerosols, then that water won't freeze until like negative 20, negative 30, negative 40 C. So we're looking for clouds between about 0 degrees Celsius and negative 20 degrees Celsius that have non-precipitating drops. If we can find those, then we can fly into them, seed them, and induce snow to fall. Or if it's cold enough in the cloud but warm beneath the cloud, those initial ice crystals we make will fall and melt into rain.
Cloud seeding, of course, as you mentioned, is designed to increase precipitation and can be incredibly, helpful to many different sectors, like you mentioned, agriculture. And so, Rainmaker, for example, says like with just 1 gram of cloud seeding agent, they can generate over 10,000 gallons of rainfall, which is, incredibly, like I said, helpful to many different sectors. But, well, this may be really wonderful for an area with, like high drought, like Southern California. Many of us that like already experience very high precipitation on the Gulf are concerned that cloud seeding, whether used in the region directly or not, could potentially worsen flood conditions. Like for instance, after the Hill Country flooding, there were, rumors that it was partially caused by nearby cloud seeding trials. So can you kind of touch on this and maybe describe how legitimate are these worries, and just like go into your experience with this?
Totally. So once again, to everybody that does have concerns about cloud seeding in Texas, I hear you, I hear them, and we're always going to answer the questions that folks have about it. I think that if we do, I think that we've seen that if we do answer those questions, most of the concerns are assuaged because cloud seeding had nothing to do with those floods. And if done appropriately, as Rainmaker does it, is entirely safe and you don't have flood risk. And so, first, with respect to Texas in specific, we have what are called suspension criteria with the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. So that's the entity that says who's allowed to cloud seed, where they're allowed to cloud seed, how they're allowed to cloud seed. And one of our suspension criteria is if there's ever flash flood risk or a severe weather warning as designated by the National Weather Service, then we'll stop operating because cloud seeding in clouds that don't naturally precipitate or that wouldn't naturally precipitate, it can make a moderate but useful amount of water. Cloud seeding in clouds that are already pouring down, you wouldn't want to do, obviously, because they're already fairly efficient. You're getting as much water from them as you need. And so we won't operate in clouds that are already bound to precipitate. And in Texas, we stopped operating 2 days prior to when the floods began. We stopped a day prior to when the National Weather Service issued any severe weather warnings. And we emitted about 70 grams of silver iodide during our brief operation there. The amount of precipitation that cloud seeding typically induces, it's like tens to hundreds of millions of gallons. We saw trillions of gallons of precipitation from, or in excess of 1 trillion gallons from that flood. The 70 grams of silver iodide that we dispersed, it could not have even stayed suspended in that area in the atmosphere long enough to have affected that weather system, let alone enhance the amount of precipitation that we saw from the convergence of this system in the Gulf and the system in the Pacific. So that we're sure beyond a shadow of a doubt not to have contributed to. Atmospheric scientists and meteorologists across the country have corroborated this, and we're always happy to talk about details if people have further questions, or if you guys do. With respect to affecting other areas, right? The question of, well, the Gulf gets enough water, enough precipitation. If people are cloud seeding in California or if they're cloud seeding in the panhandle of Texas, will that cause issues for us? Cloud seeding, unlike geoengineering or solar radiation modification, it's pretty spatiotemporally localized, meaning its effects occur over the course of 90 minutes to a couple hours, and those aerosols persist and then precipitate out of the cloud over the course of a few hours. And so that means that the region that you can affect, it's not quite a county, but it's a little bit larger than that. And there is so much water in the atmosphere that modifying, say, precipitation patterns with cloud seeding in Southern California or in Arizona or New Mexico, or even one side of the state of Texas to the other, would not be enough to materially affect the other side. Like I said, we can produce a material and useful amount of precipitation, but not enough to change the state of the atmosphere overall of Texas.
What is the time scale when it comes to administering the procedure and seeing the effects? Is it something that dissipates in a matter of like days? Is it something that, because this is not climate modification, it's weather modification, I understand. So how long does a treatment last and how long does it stay suspended, like you mentioned?
Yeah. So, like you said, it's weather modification, and so it's local. And so we'll cloud seed, and then you'll see nucleation. That's the liquid water freezing onto the silver iodide over the course of 5 to 30 minutes. And then you'll see precipitation subsequently in just as much time as it takes for those particles to grow a bit larger and fall to the ground. And so that means really like the full effect of your operation happens over the course of a couple hours once you see precipitation on the ground thereafter.
So with 1 gram, like having the potential to create like 10,000 gallons, like how kind of careful are you with the dosing? Is it typically like grams at a time, or what is typically generating 10,000 gallons at a time, or what is the demand?
So we use about 50 grams of silver iodide in each of our operations. That's about as much as you can fit in your hand, maybe a little bit more than that. The really key thing to contextualize this, though, is that 50 grams is dispersed over hundreds of thousands or millions of acres. right? Because you're emitting it as these very fine aerosol particles that flow over and throughout the entire cloud. And so you can induce that like roughly 1 gram to 10,000 gallons of precipitation, but it's not in a column on one spot. It's over an entire watershed. And so that 50 grams that we use after a certain point, after maybe it'd be 60 or 70 grams, you couldn't even get more juice out of the cloud, so to speak, just by introducing more material.
What do you imagine is the role of regulation and policymakers when it comes to cloud seeding and weather modification at large? Like, how do you think the two kind of spaces intersect?
It's super important. It's super important. And I've never stopped advocating that there be requirements for transparency and regulations for safety's sake from state and the federal government. Cloud seeding laws exist on the books of a lot of these states. Cloud seeding laws and regulations actually exist within the federal code for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. However, those are from the 70s, right? For the most part. So what I think makes sense is for states to absolutely ensure that their people know what's going on, and anywhere that there is cloud seeding happening, reporting is required so that constituents can see what's happening, can themselves corroborate that what's happening is safe and in their interest. I think it's really important that the states prevent just anybody from doing cloud seeding and weather modification, because obviously you don't want someone that is going to be reckless or that is malicious to start doing weather modification. And so states like Utah or states like Texas offering a permitting and licensing framework so that only approved operators can work on weather modification, that totally makes sense. I think that at a federal level, that's probably relevant too, especially because you have interstate water resources like the Colorado River. And so if cloud seeding operations in Utah are going to produce more water for Arizona, say, what should the relationship between those states look like? Well, maybe that happens at an interstate compact level, or maybe that should happen federally. But we absolutely do need participation from these state and federal governments on regulating the space to make sure that it's safe and transparent.
Definitely. And I'm going to kind of grab onto a word you said here, but you said preventing malicious actors. And I find that interesting. Do you think there is a world where or potential for cloud seeding to be used in a malicious manner, or what does that kind of mean?
Antara, have you ever heard of Project Popeye?
No, I have not.
Cool. So this is relevant. Before I mentioned that if you have a cloud that's already naturally precipitating a lot, then you need not seed it, because why would you want it to precipitate even harder and heavier, potentially risk flooding?
Mm-hmm.
So back in the Vietnam War, the United States ran something called Project or Operation Popeye, excuse me, where the United States military was deliberately cloud seeding to try to induce flooding. And they were targeting these really severe monsoons. There is a world, I think, where if we don't have appropriate regulation, then one of two things could happen. Either this could be like with near peer adversaries, weaponized. It's not something Rainmaker does or is interested in doing. Or in another world where we don't have appropriate regulation because we're concerned about the weaponization of this technology, we lose out on all of its benefits, right? So there's this middle path, I think, where we acknowledge, you don't want people to be cloud seeding in areas where there's already flood risk, obviously. So you should regulate against that, but you should also not kneecap yourself and prevent farmers from getting the water that they need, and ecosystems from getting the water that they need to be conserved. And so we should still have cloud seeding as long as it's within a reasonable permitting and regulatory framework.
And then lastly, kind of just to tie everything in, how does cloud seeding as a concept or tool work in tandem with, other strategic water restoration movements, like, for instance, like desalination, aquifer recharge, or, just like managed water storage to build water security?
They're very important to blend together. like I said before, I want as much water as possible for everybody in every environment that needs it. And pursuing these other methods, conservation, responsible and stewardly irrigation and use of water in our homes, that's great. Desalination, where it's applicable, is great. But if all we do is cut up the pie smaller through conservation, we might result with quality of life reductions in some cases. And I don't really want that for people. And I don't think that human behavior generally accommodates being told just to consume less for the sake of whatever. People generally want better qualities of life and more abundant lives. And I think if we just relied on desalination or conventional modes of water storage and production, like dams and reservoirs, it'll probably take a really long time and inordinate amounts of capital to get that infrastructure in place. So we should absolutely pursue them still, but in tandem with a more immediate solution, which is clouds.
All right, well, that's all we have.
Thank you for taking the time to sit with us today.
Yeah, for sure.
Today's episode was quite a ride in the sky, but we're glad you hung on till the end. We're Andra Varma and Sara Tabres, and we thank you for listening. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. That's WESTONT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Andra Varma and Sara Tabres. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French, here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.